the panelists in case you guys don't know them. I'm sure you do anyways. We have Chris Taylor, Victoria McReynolds, and Lauren Michael Bissell. Chris Taylor is an associate professor in the College of Architecture and director of land rights of the American West at Texas Tech University. In 2001, he began developing land rights of the American West as a semester abroad in our own backyard to investigate the intersection of human construction and the evolving shape of the planet. He has published 2 books chronicling the development of this field-based incubator operating across a wide range of forces within the arid lands of America, bridging Chile with the desert southwest of North America. He is currently working to create the Great Salt Lake Exploration Platform, funded in part by the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in Fine Arts. Taylor is a graduate of the University of Florida and Graduate School of Design at Harvard.
What's your introduction right down the back? I know that.
Victoria McReynolds is a licensed California architect and visiting assistant professor at Texas Tech University College of Architecture in Lubbock, Texas. She earned her Master of Architecture in 2010 at Grand Oak Academy of Art, having focused on site-based installation of the nameless landscape of Detroit. Her Bachelor of Architecture thesis at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, situated swim hall in the dry Aurora of Mompoc Valley, California, challenging natural and social sites. Lauren Michael Bissell received her Bachelor's of Architecture from Auburn University and her post-professional Master's of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin. She also participated in the Rural Studio, an undergraduate program of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture at Auburn University. She has been a senior urban designer at Art for Architecture and Planning, as well as a designer and project architect at Mark Stone Studio. So, the goal of this dialogue is to discuss the nature of public space in America. Typical considerations of American place include the demise of civic space and the rise of themed space. American public space may differ from public space elsewhere. These differences include large-scale privatization of individual lots. Most of the American-built environment consists of these marketed public spaces that have been instituted as a design standard to American society. These places operate through the marketing of a brand image. Because of the rise of these individually themed places, have the lines between public and private been blurred. In this context, can we define themed as meaning an interrelated process of production and consumption of particular environments, whereby symbolic meaning both reflects and is reflective of larger social relations. For instance, is something like Starbucks a public space? Is it safe to say that Starbucks has designed a successfully marketed public space? And how do we as designers begin to operate within a marketed or themed sense of place?
So as themed, really, you're more so focused on the idea of consumption, not as a theme like a Coney Island theme or density, but a theme of operative, consuming, social interaction.
I think themed could go both ways, but the way that we're talking about it currently is yes. I do.
Launch.
Okay, I'll talk. I feel like Starbucks in general is a very kind of it's a microcosm in general, but it's networked all over the world as well. So I think what I'm struggling in understanding is the specificity of your question and how can you frame it in can you give me another example of how you look towards this type of themed or marketed public space? Because one could argue too that a public space, an exterior, right, like a streetscape, isn't marketed, but it's still a public space that involves consumption because you have food trucks and other types of interaction or social interaction. So I'm searching for the focus.
Okay, I think that there are several. You can go first.
Just your question's a good one, but I just want to answer your question. No. Starbucks is not a public space. Period. Full stop. I think it's starting to extrapolate into this question of a street that is a owned and managed by the municipality versus a street that exists in a urban themed commercial development. I don't know where the property lines, there's many of them in a lot of uppity urban centers where you think you're outside, but you're really not. It's the shopping mall turned inside out, so it's an illusion.
Lifestyle.
There you go.
So is that your idea of public space in America specifically, or how can we relate a particular public space in America in correlation to a public space elsewhere?
I think you've got to start with the question of what is public.
What is public space? Do you
What is
individually as
public?
happens?
Yeah.
What is public space?
Public, well, for me it's even bigger than space, but I'd like to keep the focus on space. But public is things that are bigger than one person. It's not my, it's we. So we're going to collectively own this conversation. This becomes a public conversation.
I think there's layers in that. I think the question saying Starbucks as an example of public space means there's a level of interaction. There's waiting. There's all these other types of things going on. There's internet. There's Wi-Fi. Whereas an airplane is a public space, which you're not necessarily as internet. I think an airplane can be public. It's just about this big of a space with about this many people. They're all occupying the same space.
So I definitely I enjoy the entertaining ideas that
So you?
commercial space starts to have the quality of the public in the sense that it is collective, but that's typically now where people interact with each other on a casual basis. Come across others informally, or you meet up with people. So the transfer of that occurrence typically taking place in a plaza or historical setting, and then that being now consumed, or now that's starting to happen in consumption spaces is quite interesting, but it actually at this level of ownership of who actually has rights to that space. There's a very clear definitive that commercial space is privately owned, or planes are privately owned. Most of what we have in the U.S. the roadways or the infrastructure, which is public space. So I think the roles of what used to be public space and how it was this area of informal conversation or crossing over, even more interesting in place of demonstration, has started to shift into other consumer private areas.
So I brought a couple of little statistics, and I'm not a big fan of statistics, but pushing that further and thinking about it in terms of space, and particularly in terms of land, we need to go back to the land ordinance of 1785 and track through the homestead as modern America, meaning post 1776, moves into this hemisphere and begins to take over the continent. There's a whole series of, we can break down the politics of that later, but there was a point in time after the Civil War where the land basically west of Mississippi was up for settlement of the homestead. And what wasn't homesteaded, what's left over from that, is now managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So here's some interesting numbers about the percentage of lands that are publicly owned. So this is federal and state ownership. Alaska, 89.22% of the state is owned publicly by the state or by feds. Nevada, 81%, Utah, 70%, Idaho, 66%, Wyoming, 54%. That's the top five. Texas, 1.92% of the state is owned publicly. And there's a little aberration there because Texas was first a republic and then a state, so we didn't have the great giveaway. But for me, what's powerful about these numbers is, and it's the top 10 are all Western states, and it's what's left over. Basically, it's what couldn't be given away. Because the Homestead Act allowed you, if you had the tenacity to improve a piece of land by farming, mining, ranching, and build there, you could have it for free. Not a lot of people wanted to do that in Alaska. It's also really big. But I mean, Nevada is not that big. So to me, this is a very concrete thing where compared to an airplane or a commercial enterprise, this is actual hard dirt that is not owned by any single individual.
But what's interesting is that, of course, more than 1.92% of Texas is utilized for social interaction or public environment.
But that's different than
It's different than the way that
I'm
you
thinking
think
about
about
ownership.
Right, as an ownership, that is interesting. So maybe there's a differentiation in how we force occupation or public occupation in a different way, especially in Texas, obviously, that's crazy.
The other correlation is the dramatic separation between what is publicly owned as being the residual space that people aren't at versus the spaces in which are in our cities, where again it goes back to the infrastructure, which ends up being where public space is, common space. So in many ways, right now there's a huge disconnect between what is owned being out in wilderness area away from society.
Yeah. And I think it also, I mean, comparatively to someplace in Europe or Cairo or something like this that was much more planned or organized in a different way, especially the eastern cities. It'd be interesting to see that type of those stats from Delaware and New York, and how those spaces are designed for a certain organization or a certain larger public organization, concentric circles or growth out or growth in, and how those spaces can be used for uprisings or democracy or to go against it or to have a parade or to celebrate in those types of ways. That'd be interesting to see those numbers. Stats breaking numbers.
Delaware is 7.05%.
So I believe that, because they would have been much more organized in the way that they assess public space and how those markets or social interactions should center themselves in a city context, as opposed to Alaska, which was the last frontier.
Yeah. To me, this stickling point of ownership, and to me, where Michael was starting to earlier on, before the numbers showed up, which numbers are always ugly, is the distinction between agency versus ownership.
Right.
And I think even your question about Starbucks is, do I behave like Starbucks is my living room? Do I behave when I'm in Starbucks like it's a public, it's the town square? I think the answer is neither. It's this hybrid space. And for me, the bigger conversation, both politically and architecturally, is this insidious slide illusion of public, privatization masquerading as public. Right now, we are sitting in a public university that used to be predominantly supported by the public for the betterment of the public to educate ourselves. That's no longer the case. The majority of our funding comes from other sources, comes from the backs of students paying tuition. So I would argue that we've become a private enterprise.
But that's on a macro level. I think on a micro level, the way that we occupy our own space is very different. So you can look at our studio spaces. We run those in a public way, and there's ownership within that public space.
But that's agency then, in terms of things that empower people.
Certainly, it's an empowerment of agency, but it still, I think, defines that maybe public spaces that just define this occupation. Because I can go to Starbucks and stand on tables and yell really loud, and
Yeah,
but then take a while for them to kick me out. I think.
Yeah, but then someone still has a right to be able to remove you.
That's true.
Where in public space, like the importance, still firmly believe that in the importance of our environment, it's necessary to have public spaces, or it's necessary to be able to speak freely, right? So that there isn't another authority that essentially restrains or censors what it is you may be able to believe in, as opposed to like some level where occupation is dependent on the density, but then occupying Wall Street, but then as soon as that density dwindles, like it was enough to start pushing them out of public, which was a private part of spaces, and dissipate that. So I think essentially, like, when it goes back to the final ownership, it's highly, it's dangerous on that level in the sense of assumption that we kind of have a freedom, but we don't in terms of how we behave, but we can occupy it then someone with more authority or access to jails or force, essentially force, can remove you.
So what you're saying is that even in a public space, there is a force that they control me. And so where is public? Then where is public?
but in the public street you do, whereas opposed to Starbucks or Home Depot, where there's the idea, there's the repetition or the exchange that is similar to what we consider occurs in plazas, or it's always talked about in casual interaction or formal, informal meetings that there's still a component in the street, in the infrastructure that is the shared space.
There's still a level of control. I mean, there's things that you can't get away with, and even Occupy Wall Street, the way that they come through or positions, there's still control in that. Less. But it costs to come up to us when we start doing certain extent.
So, but the switch is different. So in a public space, it's about the social norms or patterns of agreed on behavior, right? To run around doing anything you want in the public sphere doesn't fly. There's certain things that we decide, actually, that's kind of not okay. You know, baby killing thing running around, you know, mayhem, stop that. So there are thresholds here, right? In the quasi-public, in their threshold is that we get in the way with our ability to sell coffee. It has less to do with a social conscious or conversation that's meted out collectively and more to do with what's the motivation. That was, we can swap out the beverage there and swap out the nature of the clientele, and the level of acceptable behavior will run a pretty wide range, pretty fast. It won't look that much different. The lighting will change, clothes might change, or disappear. But essentially, it's all about transactions. It's a commercial space. And the motivation is about that commercial enterprise, which is much different than I'm going to go speak my mind in the town square because it's a space, it's a place where I have the right to do that. And that's a fundamental shift in how society organizes itself. That the market exchange, we express ourselves and voice what we have to say based on our ability to inflect that transaction rather than, you know, hey, come on, this is a cool idea, let's all go do something. We vote with our money rather than our action. So.
It's interesting, and I'm sure this exists in a lot of other cities, but in LA, particularly where I'm thinking about is, you walk downtown, like this sidewalk is easily 10 feet wide, but about 6 feet of that, 7 feet of that has been an easement. And so in the streetscape, in the sidewalk scape is kind of a bar or a ban that some buildings have, properties have put down that says you're on private property now, even though the materiality is continuous and the way that the street would begin to, the sidewalk would begin to function, it kind of has this open, accessible quality, but it's this looming, like it was always this ominous, like, you're now on private space. Like you have to somehow be a little more kind of censored or controlled by how you behave. And so the idea that materiality starts to blur that boundary, but then there's this other acceptable constraint that always is in the background. Someone can always just come in and cordon that off or limit that or take back the territory.
And they have, similarly in Austin on 6th Street, they have occupied, it's probably a 22-foot sidewalk and 10 or 12 feet of it is gated off. But it's still public because it's outside and it's bleeding into all the rest of the streets. There's a fence that you can't cross. You have to go through a gate, but it's still open, of course, in that way. So rather than materiality, it's a physical boundary, but it still feeds back into the public space. So it creates that type of interaction with a short boundary.
I don't want to sway your questions, but to me, right now we're just spouting off about what we think about the shape of the world, which can get pretty not very interesting for you guys.
Real fun.
But to me, a potentially more interesting question is how do we as architects navigate this world of increased privatization? And from a design standpoint, one decision is I'm just not going to work on that project. That's not going to be my client. And I make a decision that way, which is totally within my right as an architect. But the other is how, so Victoria just mentioned materiality, and if thinking about from a design context, what are, and I'm interested in the question in terms of both responsibility and ethics, as well as form resolution about how that public space is designed. Because ultimately, it's all design. It may look like a really empty landscape out around town, but every square inch of it's been touched, managed, and manipulated. It's been designed in its current configuration, whether it's producing oil, cotton, or people.
Producing people?
Places produce people.
How'd you get here? Matrix, obviously.
Could an architect design space to be just public, but isn't basically everything an architect do privatized because we're hired on by clients?
Well, you also work for the public, yeah. I mean, architects, yeah, you go through the review process of where you're engaged in the review committee, they like a whole series of people that have been put together to actually propose a public project. So the nature of the client, you can have a public client. It's a similar way to DG, except you're dealing with more diversity of who it is that you're conversing with rather than, I mean, but even a private client can be bored.
But isn't that space though regularized by the government in a way? But there's not really a space where you can do whatever you want.
That's where kind of an urban designer would come in, or a city planner, for example, and that's where you start to have a larger voice in how these things are organized. And so guidelines like sidewalk width or public space or visibility, how many windows, what are your overhangs, what are your setbacks, how do you start to navigate those more public space would be in the role of urbanism. And urban designers kind of mitigate city planners and city council, right? So they all kind of work together to make a better place. So those are opportunities. I'm not saying that.
But it comes down, though, to ownership.
Right.
So that if it's municipal land, it's governed by the land use code of that municipality. If it's private land, it's governed by either just a single owner or a condominium or a co-op or a set of developers, and they still have to conform with the city requirements. And for me, that harks me right back to one of the failures of new urbanism is there are things about it that are potentially good for cities, but a calculated decision was made early on to see their primary client as development rather than municipalities. And what that shifted the conversation to a marketing strategy of quaintness and selling good old times when life is nice. And while the porch is still there are still some structural things that actually matter and make it better. The disconnect is that it's not about improving the core structure of a city based on the social dynamics of how it operates. And that's a huge missed opportunity in the history of planning. And we can talk about it in terms of fashion, and I just don't like to look at that as pastels, nice and fluid suits, but not buildings or whatever our issues are. But for me, it's a deep structural issue, and so understanding how we operate as architects in that structural phase.
But to be fair, the urbanism is only one of many ways in which these types of city issues can be challenged. And the roles in which you prioritize as an architect, public and private, and how these things should work together, go far beyond. The urbanism was super hot in the 80s and 90s, and unfortunately there's remnants of this and this kind of way in which we organize cities, but there's all kinds of other ways to look towards that. How do we as designers tackle infrastructure? How do you tackle program? How do you tackle these larger issues with the city? And there's a lot of cities that have started to change the ways in which they try to design through with designers, with architects. How they change those public space, private space relationships, and how they prioritize not just a quaint tree-lined street, but how do you prioritize working infrastructure, whether it's sewage or cars or transit or any of these other types of things.
So I think one interesting way maybe to continue the conversation about architects' participation, and maybe not so much public or private, but the idea of the collective, the individual. Right? So it's public space, there's an ability of people to gather in masses, or that there's a shared commonality. And so in the collective space, and quite often, or I'll start with the reverse, right? And knowing, working through projects where there's been an exaggeration of the hierarchy, like further stratification of the hierarchy, access spaces in which are more difficult to access versus spaces which are more readily available or are inclusive of streetscapes or inclusive of moving from the outside to the inside. That type of exaggeration further identifies exclusivity versus collectivity. And so as architects, you can design, you can strategize and start to design spaces that celebrate or play off the role of continuing collective way of gathering or shared space as opposed to fragmented or individual space. And so those can almost be appropriated differently, where like in this building, there are these subspaces, and so each space can quite easily take on its own territory, quite easily become more individualized. It's not public, or I guess, okay, so Chris pointed out kind of the obscurities of the public and private.
This is public. We're on state land right now, right?
Yeah, but earlier,
I don't know,
earlier, you're exactly pointing out the funding primarily came from 80% of privatization. So, however, we'll just say it's public. But what Goselle was pointing out earlier is that since you're in your space, studio more frequently, then there's the opportunity of that becoming like the territory. Start to further exaggerate type of ownership as opposed to the gallery space, which is more difficult to say. You brought your desk and your chair down here and then started working. There's more the ability of other people to come in and interrupt you is much more accessible, it's more frequent. So another way of considering, maybe not moving away from the definition of public and private, but another way of starting to consider qualities of the spaces, the collective versus the individual.
I think it's also, just to continue with that, as an architect taking a position on what is the collective and what is the individual, like how do you start to set up a space that can facilitate those types of back and forth? Like it's saying, oh, I'll put a green space, if you build it, it doesn't mean they'll come. How do you really take ownership also as an architect to give back in that way, to have something designed that can have these opportunities of collective or individual in the public realm instead of just kind of throwing it out on the table. I think is also an important thing in our role and responsibility.
I mean, what we could start talking about is a heterotopia, and maybe talking about heterotopia in other place could help us understand which way the American public space is going. So it's sort of a different sector of American life, and we have this quote right here from Michael Foucault. There are also, and this is probably in all culture and all civilizations, real places, effective places. Places that are written into the institution of society itself, a sort of effectively realized utopias in which the real places are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. A kind of places that are outside all places, even though they're actually localized. Since these places are absolutely other than all the interests that they reflect, and of which they speak, I call them, by way of contrast to utopias, heterotopias. So I guess maybe one of the easiest examples of that would be sort of public/living place. There's one specifically in Florida that's called the Village. And it's this absurd kind of sector in the city, and it's almost like being on a movie set where everything is kind of marketed or branded or fake in a way. So it could maybe be a question of, do us as designers, like, are we always able to create these themes in American society, or is it American society that's beginning to tell us what sort of themes or heterotopias to create? And as a designer, how do we begin to contest that or work with that?
Well, I think that the Village, which is similar to Seaside, I'm guessing, the same kind of mentality. You know what Seaside is? Does anybody know that? Yes, okay. So there's two ways you go about it. Either as an architect, you say, this is how you should do it. Or you say, oh, this is how you are living. How can I then allow public space to kind of enable that and facilitate? So there's a difference in saying, using branding or the consumption to say, I'm going to line this, I'm going to use consumption as kind of bait, and this is how you should live, or this is how you should organize. Or do you see the patterns in which they use consumption and they actually interact and have these accidental opportunities of interaction to then facilitate a design decision and how you make those public spaces? So I think this is very specific in setting something out very quickly and very intently and allowing people to populate. That's why it kind of looks like a theme park in some ways, similar to Seaside. As opposed to looking at a downtown or dynamicism within downtown that has all of the same things going on. They're just operating in a different way that is the people, I think, more telling us how they live and less of us. I'm not always pointing out those two extremes that I see the way the rest of us things. The villages.
So, quote.
People's dreams can come true.
Finally.
Gosh, I've been waiting. That's what we do as architects. No, we do allow people's dreams to come true, but that was a very specific dream that involved a very specific golf course and a very specific light blue party sighting and a white picket fence. Always, I said. So there's two ways to think of that kind of heterogeneity.
And then, what is, into your question is, as architects, how do we either embrace this idea of the theme or handle? Because the way can you just repeat your question again, please, about the really, like, your question is sort of extended from this and
Extended from this, how do you intend to navigate, and also is it us as designers creating these things, or is it these social or the social norms that are beginning to tell us how to design or how we should design, or how do you navigate between those two concepts?
the first level, it would be the relationship with the client, and like what projects you have. Which I said before, like what type of projects do you take on? But the other thing I think about as well is the way in which you start to organize spaces that are either intended as a type of consumption or that boundary range between thematic space and public space and other more private spaces. And in particular, I'm thinking about, I'm so excited to use this example, hotel bars, right? Like, so I actually consider hotel bars as an example of a type of heterotopia because it is embodied within the hotel of what's supposed to be like the getaway, the utopia, someone's utopia away from their daily life to be able to retreat into this other world. And then the bar is being the place where, of course, it's libations and you enjoy some other alternative world. And so as a in particular, Biltmore in Los Angeles, but you can masquerade, okay, not necessarily as an architect yet, just let me describe accessing these spaces. You masquerade as a type of consumer to a certain access point. And then you're able to penetrate a commercial zone or penetrate a private zone and engage in that environment that's constructed there. So as an architect, one position in considering that relationship is like the location of where it is you consume, and in the consumption all the way to the periphery of that boundary between the public and the commercial of the public and the themes. And that becomes an experience. Like you have, as an architect, you have potential to introduce layers of transition from one quality of space to the other. I think it's more about subverting those relationships rather than, the thematic is, I think, less interesting as a type of branding identity, and more about introducing or starting to create interiors, public spaces on the interior, or quality of, not public space, but quality of communal space or program space.
And I think what this brings up is, even though your question is really urban focused, or how does public space work as a network and a large context, as architects, we deal with this relationship of public and private all day long, right? So communal space, be it privately funded or not, still has a certain relationship to private spaces. So the theme, I still kind of find, I think themed spaces, I mean, this one could argue this is a themed space, right? It's a classical, those types of scenarios. And in this condition, I don't necessarily think that that theme is suggesting a certain spatial awareness. But I still think people are going to operate the way that people are going to operate. I mean, we can work with transition, we can work with these different types of relationships with public and private urbanistically at the scale of the city, or even at the scale of this hotel bar. You can start to kind of divvy this up and take a position on how those things work together within, I find it hard with the theme as the heterotopia, because I think it's very different.
Heterotopia is a theme. It's
No, I
other.
know.
Yeah.
But the way that we're layering theme in, think of Coney Island, right? Theme park, which is a place and has those things as well.
Would a museum count as a themed public space? I mean, if it's art or natural history, but you still can do everything you want to do. Someone's going to kick you out if you get in trouble. But is that still a public space?
Some of them are.
Most of the time you have to pay to get in, so.
Right.
But it's actually a great question, because for me, it's a question that's interesting in terms of how we navigate as people, as citizens. But also, it's a question about public ownership of knowledge. Right? The idea of a museum is that these works are valuable culturally to our identity, and we're going to hold them in trust. It's a library as well, right? We're going to hold them in trust because for the future of this moment and moments after this, we value them. And that's it has a deep civic place to it. And so, I mean, there are private museums that are all about celebrating the glory of the collector and that. And there's that action has produced a great many powerful collections that have become public or operate essentially public, even though they are effectively private. The Morgan Library and Museum in New York, for example, comes right out of JP's hard-earned goodwill.
Crystal Bridges, funding from Walmart.
So these things are, it's interesting, to me, again, it's agency, how we act, how we operate in that, and do we aspire to a collectivity, to a public, or do we aspire to, what's the quickest path to fruition? To quote my friend Gabor. I want to go back to the heterotopia, though, because to me the thing that it makes me think about is if we think about the history of coming out of modernism, which was partly about a break with tradition, but also about a clean slate, making new, and then bringing that forward into actual urban people would be better able to talk about this or outline this history. But Broadacre City and the birth of suburbia, they were all predicated on this idea of utopia, on we're going to make it, we can think our way out of this, and we can solve, and we can decide exactly how people want to be together, and how close they want to be to deer, and how close they want to be to shrubbery, and figure it all out. And it's kind of work, but it's also a random disaster. Right? The urban spaces that we're really excited about aren't that single-minded. They have a density and an integration. I map it onto an understanding of the environment, and ecosystems are hard to understand with the myopic lens of utopia. They're much more like heterotopias. They're much more, there's many layers going on, they're competing, they don't all make sense, some things contradict each other, but there's a symbiosis that makes it thrive. And appreciating public space and the urban or non-urban environment as much weirder than it appears at first is a way healthier.